So is sprawl just what people want? And the evidence suggests no, it's not. There's specific organizational and structural factors that encourage and create sprawl. We're going to look at specific examples, starting with subsidies, tax dollars. The way that subsidies are set up make it cheaper to live in the suburbs because people living there aren't really paying the full cost. Those costs are externalized onto all of us. They also don't pay the full cost of driving to the suburbs or using the infrastructure that has to reach all the way out there. There's also explicit policies, planning and zoning and parking requirements that made urban living more expensive and suburban living cheaper, which also incentivizes sprawl. And so if we created different policies, would we therefore have different outcomes? And so we'll look at some alternatives as well, possible solutions. And then one last example of the mortgage income tax deduction we'll talk about when we get to it. So subsidies first. Housing subsidies, the unnatural American dream. The American dream, the detached single family home, this is not made in a vacuum. It's a result of specific historical developments, choices, policies, and subsidies. And so where do the subsidies go? Housing subsidies. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established, and this was sort of during the heart of the Great Depression under FDR. The idea of the Housing Administration was to get people building houses. This provides jobs, and it also provides housing for people. They discouraged multifamily units. The focus was on the single-family home because you can build more and sell more, right? More jobs, more housing. Despite the initial aims of the subsidies, most houses were actually purchased by the more affluent. After World War II, the Federal Housing Administration has an even bigger effect. There's a big need of housing at this time because very little building went on during the war. For example, the Detroit Free Press, 1945, soldiers can't come home. There aren't any houses. Subsidies grew dramatically at this time. And so the result of increased housing subsidies is who benefited? Again, mostly the affluent. This is where the money went. It went to house building in agricultural lands that were to become the suburbs. There's a study in St. Louis that looked at where the subsidies went from 1934 to 1960. So if you look at city versus country meaning suburban, there's five times the amount of money went to the suburbs than it did to the city. And the average loan each person in the suburbs got was about 6 times higher than the average loan the person in the city got. So if you look, only about 12,000 loans to the city, over 60,000 went to the county, the suburbs. Total amount of money, about 94 million to the city. Almost 600 million to the county. Average loan per person in the city, a little over 100, close to 800 for people in the suburbs. And so if the money, you get more money, more of a subsidy, cheaper rent, if you will, by living in the suburbs, what does this then encourage? It encourages people to live there. Not just housing subsidies, so people aren't paying the full cost of housing because they're getting tax dollars, government money for that house. We also subsidize highways and the infrastructure in these sprawl developments. So the roads to get out there and the infrastructure, meaning the water and sewer lines, the phone and electric lines, schools, all fire and police, all these services that are also required. For example, the community of Westwood, established in 1922. And if you look at the picture on the slide, this is where Westwood went. Look at the sort of advertisement on the right. Westwood, as Westwood develops, watch prices jump. You can get your place now, right? It's in the heart of assured development. There's nothing here now, but there will be. And you can get a great deal on living out here. And so you pay for the home, you pay for the lot, but what about the roads that had to be built to get out to this sprawl development? The people that benefited and bought these homes didn't pay for those roads. All of us with tax dollars paid for those roads, but not all of us use them. Not all of us benefit, right? It's cheaper to live in the suburbs because you're not actually paying the full cost of living out there. The roads, the infrastructure, we all pay into that, but we don't all use it, right? What about non-price tag costs, like habitat damage, right? That's not even sort of included. And so one of the points is that if these externalities were actually priced in, the extra infrastructure to create sprawl developments, the roads, the habitat damage, people might make different choices. If we actually priced the true costs into what we pay, people probably would not make these choices. They would not live in sprawl developments, and we wouldn't have all the associated costs with sprawl, environmental damage, climate change, social consequences. And so we all pay through taxes for infrastructure, roads, police, fire. But the infrastructure costs for spread out housing developments are way more expensive than concentrated multi-dwelling units. So if you look at the chart, infrastructure includes local streets, water, sewer lines, recreational facilities, and then also police, fire, solid waste collection and disposal, library, health, and general government. And so all these services, all this infrastructure that people use, we all pay for it, but it costs so much more to develop this in sprawled areas. So for example, a single family unit on 1 acre, so one single family home on 1 acre, about $60,000 in total costs for infrastructure and service costs. By comparison, more concentrated multi-unit dwellings. Garden apartments, 15 units per acre, half, only $30,000 in infrastructure costs. And for 30 units per acre, only about $16,000 respectively. Because you need less overall infrastructure because it's not so spread out. Therefore, it costs less. And so all taxpayers pay for these services, for this infrastructure that serve these single family homes. But not everyone lives in a single family home. Rich people, affluent people, people living in the suburbs are getting twice the subsidy of the poor. We all pay for the cost of them being spread out, but only some get to enjoy the benefits. Okay, other examples. And we're going to look at sort of a lot of different examples of what encourages and creates sprawl. So keeping the big picture in mind, that this idea that it's not natural or inevitable. Vehicle subsidies. People that live in sprawl developments that have to drive out there and commute to work also don't pay the full cost of vehicle use. This comes from the Congress Office of Technology Assessment. Vehicle users pay only 68% of actual highway costs and only 60% of actual vehicle use costs. They say that landing on the moon was a wild dream the last time drivers actually paid the full cost of driving on the roads. Everyone pays for this infrastructure, for securing fossil fuels, for all these other things that go into driving, into building the roads. Not everyone drives, and not everyone drives the same amount, right? People that are walking and bicycling, they're paying into all these subsidies for drivers. What are they get? They're not getting a subsidy for walking, right? Or riding their bike. Without subsidies, the costs for drivers would increase by about 30%. And so if drivers actually paid the full cost, this love of driving, the individual default, oh, we love cars, that's why we drive, this would greatly reduce, right? Subsidies, them not paying the full cost of driving, results in them driving more. And these vehicle costs, that's not even including the cost of invading other countries to secure oil supplies, right? That would increase things even more. And so one of the main points is we need environmentally honest pricing. We need to include all the internal costs of production and marketing, of making the stuff, and also all the external costs to human health and the environment through pollution or whatever else. These externalities need to start being priced in if consumers are to actually make rational choices. But it's difficult to measure these externalities. How do you measure what a ton of CO2 should cost someone to emit? Right? How do you put a price tag on that? So it's tricky. On the slide, the trade-offs and advantages of environmental taxes and fees. One advantage is by pricing in the true cost of production of the stuff we use, including the externalities in the price tag, it will bring about honest pricing so that consumers either don't want to pay that full cost and they'll switch to other companies or other products that may be more sustainable. Or if they'll pay that full cost and the money can be used to offset damage done to the environment or other. Second, the advantages. This, by including externalities, it encourages businesses to develop environmentally beneficial technologies and goods to save money. So if it becomes more expensive to be polluting rather than green, companies will change what they're doing. They'll become more green in order to cut their costs, stay profitable, and stay in business, right? It's about the way the policies in the system is set up that structures the incentives that drives the behavior. We've got to get the incentives right if we want to have different outcomes. Another benefit is this could be easily administered by the existing tax agencies we already have. We already have a tax structure to collect and redistribute wealth. So we could use that. Disadvantages, and this is a huge one. Low-income groups are penalized unless safety nets are provided. So, for example, a gas tax, which we have in California, and just a bit hypothetical here. So say, hypothetically, for gas, if we have a gas tax, let's say you have to pay 10 cents more per gallon of gas, and then that tax goes to offsetting the environmental impact of carbon emissions or whatever. Okay, for some people that might be inconvenient or kind of annoying, or maybe you don't get to go out to eat quite as much, whatever. But for other people, that 10 cents, that 1/10 of a dollar, that's the difference between putting dinner on the table for them and their kids that night and not. And so there has to be social safety nets, mechanisms in place to protect vulnerable populations so that people aren't unequally affected by this, unequally burdened by pricing these externalities in. Also, another disadvantage, it's hard to determine the optimal level for taxes and fees. How much should CO2 emission cost? How much should, fertilizer tax, dumping too much fertilizer on your lawn cost, right? How do you actually measure this stuff and put a price tag on it? And then one other disadvantage, governments, and they do this all the time, might use the money as general revenue. So basically use the money for whatever the fuck they want instead of actually using it towards improving environmental quality, reducing taxes on income. They might not use the money for what they're supposed to use it for. Okay, so subsidies. People don't pay the true cost of the houses or the transportation to get there or the infrastructure that has to be built all the way out there. And it makes living in sprawl development cheaper than it really is. Many of the costs are externalized. There's also policies that have made urban living more expensive and sprawl development cheaper, at least artificially in the price tag, again, because all these costs are externalized. And so let's focus on explicit policy for a moment. Planning and zoning requirements. The earliest example of explicit policies surrounding zoning, and zoning means this area is zoned for residential and that you can only have housing here. You can't have business or other activities. So it's zoned as residential or business or other. And the earliest example of this in the U.S. comes from San Francisco in 1867. The idea was isolate the dangerous, the odoriferous, stuff that people don't want in their backyard, like tar boiling, carcass burning, fat rendering, other sort of smelly or dangerous activities. Zone them to a separate area so that it's to keep property values up, keep residential communities nicer. In LA, by 1909, zoning requirements began to extend to large undeveloped areas. So this area is and will be only for housing. The focus was on the single family home versus other uses like business or recreational. And the goal was to protect property values. Don't allow other offensive activities in the same area. Keep the property values up. There was a huge legal issue battle over this because for a lot of people this doesn't work, right? A lot of people like to live, work, play all in the same areas and don't have a means to commute to these different destinations. Zoning ended up winning, and after 1945, this led to huge zones of developmental uniformity. So housing only, no mixed use, no businesses allowed, which means people, when they go to work, have to travel far to get to work. It can't be in the same community. Sort of the extreme of developmental uniformity is gated communities, right? Or homeowners associations where everyone's house has to be the same color of taupe, and you can't park on the street, and you can't have I remember a neighborhood around where I lived. I didn't live in it, but you couldn't park cars on the street. You could have one car in the driveway and that's it. If people came to visit, I'd fucking figure it out. You weren't allowed to park in the streets. They didn't like how it looked. So that's sort of on the extreme side. One alternative to uniform homogeneous zoning is mixed use. So see sort of on the bottom versus the top picture, have residential, but also business, also stores, healthcare, recreational, all these different things we do, have it all be in the same place so people don't have to drive and travel really far in between what they're doing. Another example, subdivision requirements in sprawl developments also eat up and waste land, which means we have to build even more sprawled infrastructure to reach these units. Everyone pays for that. Not everyone enjoys the benefits. Examples of subdivision requirements. There's setback requirements, so the house has to be a certain distance from the driveway. You have a long driveway because it looks pretty. Whoever decided. A minimum lot size, so it can only be it has to be at least this big. Minimum street width. And also, ironically, with all these requirements, there's also open space requirements, right? Where there can't really be anything. One alternative, because all of these things encourage more spread out development, one alternative to this is something called cluster development. And so cluster development is one subdivision with one transit line, one sewer line, one water line, etc. And so you just have one main transit and infrastructure line, and then the housing is built all along that. It cuts down on costs and environmental impacts big time. Other policies that have encouraged sprawl, created it even. Beginning in the 1940s, there started to be policies that required businesses and apartments in the city to provide parking. Well, not just in the city, but that's where it's a little more difficult to find parking, right? So in 1946, and remember, National City Line starts buying up public transit in the 1940s. All these things sort of start coalescing. In 1946, only 17% of U.S. cities had requirements for parking, that businesses have to provide parking. In just 5 years, by 1951, 71% of U.S. cities had these parking requirements. And the result is increased costs in the cities because businesses and apartments pass the cost of these required parking services onto the consumer, either through paycheck deduction or through increased rent. Even if it's not explicitly passed on, the cost is passed on, which makes urban living more expensive. The result is housing costs are higher in these areas. It becomes cheaper to live in sprawled development. Shoup wrote this book, The High Cost of Free Parking, just more on minimum parking requirements. He says the average car is parked 95% of the time, so most of the time, yet it uses 3 to 4 spaces. I mean, remember LA, 60% of the land area is devoted to pavement. You have a space at home, but you also have a space when you drive to school. There's also a space you use when you go to the store, when you go to work. And so parking is free for 99% of trips and free for 90% of jobs, but it's not free in actual costs. Again, it's passed on to the consumer in rent, or at SDSU, for example, they take the money out of faculty paychecks to pay for parking. So it's not actually free. And there's all these other externalities, environmental and social costs. While an office worker needs on average 250 square feet of space, his or her car requires 400 square feet of space. It's estimated that 2 billion spaces exist in this country, but only 200 million cars. So 2 billion spaces, but only 200 million cars. Today, that's more like 260, 270 million, but still serves the same point. And Shoup said one study in LA, 30% of traffic in LA was just people driving around looking for free spaces, looking for somewhere to park. That's a million extra miles a year, just looking for parking. Shoup says that he calls it a real estate subsidy for the affluent, right? We all pay into the parking, the infrastructure, this increased costs, but not everyone drives. Not everyone drives as much. Not everyone uses these services, but we all pay. So we've been talking about the problems. Are there alternatives? One possible solution to cars, parking requirements, all this other stuff is automobility systems like Zimride or Zipcar. You can rent cars by the hour or the day. Gas and insurance is included. And so if you don't drive a lot, this actually can save you quite a bit of money on car ownership, because if you own a car, it has to be insured, right? Whether you're using it or not. Automobility systems, you just sort of pay when you're using it and then don't pay when you're not using it. They're available in different cities and airports around the world. You can save hundreds of dollars on car ownership. You can choose from different types of cars, vans, hybrids, sedans. Membership as low as $6 a month. It depends on what you're doing. Or Lyft and Uber as other examples, these rideshare services. If we're doing rideshare, we need less parking, less infrastructure. Remember, you need about 250 square feet of space. Your car needs about 400 square feet of space. So we could save on this with rideshare. Scooters as another alternative. Walking, we could walk. Americans walk the least of any industrialized nation. Studies employing pedometers found that the average Australian takes about 9,600 steps per day. The average Japanese, a little over 7,000. The Swiss, almost 10,000. The average American takes about 5,000 steps a day. No one walks in this country. And so houses seem cheaper because so many costs aren't in the price tag. The excess roads, the infrastructure, the services required to accommodate sprawl development. It's just not included. And so it's artificially cheaper, but the costs continue socially and environmentally to mount. Common realtor advice, drive until you can afford it. Because the further out you go, usually the cheaper housing is. And this incentivizes people to live in sprawled developments. For example, if you try to buy a house in San Diego, on a budget, are you going to go look in La Jolla or sort of downtown Little Italy, or are you going to have better luck finding something affordable maybe in La Mesa or El Cajon, right, or National City? And so evidence suggests sprawl is not just what people want. There's specific policies, choices, and structures that have created it for us. And so if we had different policies, could we achieve different outcomes? Are there alternatives to the way we're doing things? And the answer is yes. So let's look at a couple of examples. Example one, Germany. So they are home of the Autobahn system, which is sort of a model interstate system. It's a freeway system that doesn't really have a speed limit. You can drive pretty fast. But one of the reasons that this works is because in Germany, the Autobahn is not the only mode of transportation. So you have different options depending on where you're going. If you want to take a long trip on the Autobahn, go for it. It's fairly efficient. And because it's only used for certain trips or going certain places, and what I mean is there's not an entrance and an exit ramp every 100 feet for people to get on and off. There's few and far in between, which is sort of why it works. People can go fast, go long distances, get where they're going. If they want to make a shorter trip or a different type of trip, there's other types of transportation that exist for that. And so the car is an option, but it's not the primary form of transportation. Germany is also home to a dense railroad network. The country is roughly the size of Alabama, but you can catch a train without leaving major airports, and from there you can get to most cities pretty easily. And so it's a good example of efficient public transportation. They have a combination. There's options for cars, but also public transit. Europe in general, through planning and policy and the way they've designed their streets, cars are sort of more expensive and more inconvenient, and public transit is cheaper and more convenient, just through the way things have been designed. Example two, Curitiba, Brazil. And so in Curitiba, a few decades ago was not very densely populated and also not very affluent. In 1950, the population was around 300,000. By 1990, it had increased sixfold up to 1.7 million. And so a lot of development also occurred coinciding with this population growth. And in 1971, the mayor made a conscious choice in how they decided to design the city. And they decided to go for sustainable design, consciously. And so they have a city center with a pedestrian mall you can see pictured on the slide. And they emphasize parks, so open space, recreational, but also mixed use so that housing, jobs, healthcare, school, transport, all these things are in the same area so that sprawl and driving are not necessary. And what they did is they interlinked growth axes, areas that were growing, with mass transit. So development only occurred along mass transit lines, or areas that were linked to them. They were able to do this at 6 times the normal housing density to relative to other areas. And also low-income housing was emphasized, so it's not just for the wealthy or the affluent, but for everyone. And it was designed as an integrated system with healthcare, transportation, housing, jobs, all integrated and connected to cut down on the consequences of sprawl and driving. And so what I want you to do now is we're going to watch one more clip. It's talking about what happened in Curitiba, Brazil. So go ahead, pause lecture, watch the clip. It's less than 2 minutes, and then come back to lecture. We have just a few more things to talk about before we wrap up. Okay, so hopefully you watched the clip. And I sort of like what the guy says at the end. The cars are like your mother-in-law, right? You need to have a good relationship, but you cannot lead them to determine and lead your lives, right? You can't let them determine your life, just like the mother-in-law. And so in Curitiba, they have, one of the things they did was this bus system that has these tube stations pictured here. And so there's no steps, which means it's handicap accessible. You can get right from the station onto the bus. There's 245 routes. So you can get all over the area. 17,300 daily trips, so it's convenient. You're not waiting hours in between buses. Actually, you're waiting less than a minute. During rush hour, buses come once per minute, sometimes even once per 30 seconds. Also, the buses are able to operate the traffic lights, so they sort of have priority. So if the bus is coming, that should stay green or turn green for them. This makes it more efficient for buses versus cars, which sort of incentivizes people to take the bus. It might be quicker. It might be more convenient. The goal is make that more convenient, incentivize that, and you'll have people behave differently. People will make different choices. Each bus express lane carries about 20,000 passengers per hour. That's a lot. That's 4 times as much as Rio's new subway carries at 1/200th the cost. So there are alternatives. There are other ways to do things. San Diego's trying to change in terms of transportation. We have the Rapid Bus Project, which has actually been improving, getting sort of bigger and bigger. They're getting more routes around San Diego, connecting major areas like downtown and up north towards Claremont. And even as of 2018, the buses are now on the 805 and some of the major freeways. The idea is have direct routes, have frequent intervals, make taking the bus more convenient and attractive than driving your car. And just recently, any of you that have been on El Cajon in North Park, I'm not sure how much of El Cajon has changed, maybe the whole road, but it used to be 3 lanes for cars. Now it's only 2 lanes, and the 3rd lane is dedicated to buses only, right? So that lane's clear. The buses actually can usually move faster than the cars. Make that more convenient than driving. On the trolley, we have a few other examples of San Diego trying to change. One of the problems is we have built all these freeways and roads over previous public transportation systems. And you can't just undo that, right? We can't just go back over that. Sort of the damage has sort of been done. So we have to work within the existing infrastructure now. Third and last example, sustainable design in how you build homes. And so this example comes from Davis, California in the late 1970s. They built these village homes. At the time, realtors shunned the idea. These places now sell for much higher price comparative to nearby areas. And so they were basically practicing sustainable design before it was fashionable. Some of the things they did in the Davis Village homes, instead of putting in concrete drains for water management, they use swales. So swale, basically like a grassy depression or little irrigation ditch. And so you don't need the concrete. It's also more aesthetically pleasing. There's less heat creation, and it's more environmentally friendly. It also helps with water conservation. The water can be reabsorbed into the ground and the grass and the soil instead of running off into the sewer system. They have narrower streets, and also the streets are lined by these green belts. So there's more open green space, less asphalt and concrete. One of the results of this is summer outdoor temperatures are 15 degrees lower. Because you don't all have all those blacktops, those streets absorbing and re-radiating heat. Like the darker the surface, the more heat it collects, which is then released back out. Housing is at 2 times the average density, but because of the way it was built, there's 25% more open space relative to nearby areas. And streets enter sort of on opposite sides. So there's streets that pass through the housing development, but they don't cross each other, right? You go in and out on the same street. So that if you want to get anywhere else, you have to walk. And so car use is 15 to 20% lower than average. And residents know 3 times as many neighbors. This is also good, right? Social interaction leads to group and collective action, collective problem solving. And the houses use passive solar cooling and heating. So they face the greenways, and just by the way the architecture is designed and the surroundings are designed, the heating and cooling for the home is regulated more by the design, by the way the sunlight enters or doesn't enter the house, by what type of materials surround the outside of the house. And so home energy costs are 50 to 60% lower because people don't need to use heating and AC nearly as much, if at all. Originally, realtors shunned the idea. They thought it was stupid. These houses now sell for more than other areas. $11 more per square foot, to be exact. And so is sprawl just what people want? No, and there's other ways that we could be doing this. One last example of encouraging sprawl, which is something called the mortgage tax deduction. Just a quick last example to wrap up. So take this mansion located at 16270 Via de la Valle, Rancho Santa Fe, California. 8 bedrooms, 14 baths, giant-ass kitchen, a gym, pool, an equestrian facility with 7 stalls in the barn for your horses, parking for 9 vehicles, although I bet you could fit way more than that, a pool, all the luxuries. Asking price just a little over $15 million at the time. This was listed a couple of years ago. And guess what? You, with your tax dollars, are helping pay for this person's mansion. Have you ever heard of the middle class mortgage deduction? Essentially, what it allows people to do is if they have bought a home, they can deduct a percentage of what they pay on their mortgage from their taxes. And so if I bought a home and paying all this money on my mortgage, I put that on my taxes, and basically I get money back on my taxes, which is akin to a pay raise. So $100 billion per year is spent on the middle class mortgage deduction. Because it's for homeowners only, none of it goes to renters. 30% of households, if not more, are renters. These are probably the people that need subsidies and monetary assistance. Of the $100 billion, 10% of that goes just to the top 0.7%. So less than a percent. 10% goes to less than the top 1%. These are households that own over 200,000 per year, make over 200,000 per year. And then 50% of that 100 billion goes to the top 10%, households that make over 100,000 per year. For $200,000 income households, that means that they're getting $15,000 to $20,000 back on their income taxes. They're getting a check essentially for almost 20 grand each year because they can deduct what they pay in their taxes because they're paying it on their mortgage. It's a mansion subsidy. It doesn't do anything to encourage home ownership among the less affluent because the amount of money you get back is dependent on how expensive the house is. So if it's not that expensive, you're not really getting that much money back on your taxes. And what it does is it encourages larger houses, especially among the affluent, because the more expensive of the house that I buy, the bigger the check I'm going to get on my taxes. It doesn't incentivize homeownership as it was originally designed to do. And actually, it rewards the already affluent that can already afford to buy houses. This just to show you sort of another example of what I'm talking about. Only 1/3 of combined spending on the mortgage income deduction and Section 8 go to low income housing. Basically, the money that is supposed to help people with housing doesn't go to people that need help. We find that although renter households are far more likely to need assistance, federal housing benefits go disproportionately to homeowners. In fact, the amount spent on the mortgage income deduction is well over double the amount that goes to Section 8. So 71 billion spent on the mortgage income deduction or middle class income deduction and only 30 billion on Section 8. So just to give you an idea where the subsidies go to the more affluent. So in sum, is sprawl just what people want? Is it just a force of nature? These natural processes are aided by direct subsidies of housing costs, makes houses cheaper because people don't pay the full cost. Indirect subsidies of highways and infrastructure. People that live in sprawl development don't pay the full cost of the roads and the infrastructure required. And explicit policies like parking and zoning requirements that make city living more expensive. And indirect subsidies like the mortgage tax deduction, which actually pay people for buying big houses. Otherwise, yeah, sprawl is natural and just what people want. If you take out all of these subsidies and the policies that encourage and create sprawl and highways and car use and spread out infrastructure, then yeah, they're natural processes. Right? The point is these things are not inevitable. They're built into the system and often in ways that benefit a few of us rather than the majority of us. And so that'll do it for sprawl. We have just one more quick talk this week on sort of the future. If things aren't set in stone, if this isn't inevitable, what might the future look like and what can we do to shape it how we want it to be to get different outcomes. So we'll sort of touch on that and wrap up the course in our next talk, and then that'll do it for us. All right, take care.